Hello, everyone. We see you coming into the room. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll give a couple of minutes, couple of seconds here to make sure that we get everyone in. There are a lot of folks joining us today. We're very excited to have you. We're going to continue to let folks come into the room. Okay, it's slowing down a little bit, but nope, still some folks coming in. Everyone, thank you very much for joining as folks continue to join us in the room. It's good to see you today. Again, just a couple minutes longer and we'll get started. Hi, Randy, I see your question already. There is very little in the PowerPoint. We're mostly going to be hearing this. The webinar will be recorded and you will be able to play it again once it goes up on our website. You'll see that we're only going to be using the PowerPoint very briefly here. Hey, folks are continuing to join us. It takes a little while for folks to be able to get in. Excellent. Thanks, Randy. Okay, it looks like we've got just about everybody in that's going to be joining us today. I want to thank you all. It is great to have you with us. I'm Mickey McIntyre. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Compassion and Choices. First off, I have to do a quick shout out to our many volunteers and supporters in Florida who may be having their own battle with Hurricane Ian, right now. While I'm not there now, I do actually live there, and so I wanted folks to know that I'm thinking about them as the hurricane is moving on land right now, and we're missing their ability to be with us today. But know that our thoughts and prayers go out to you for your safety. Today is about safety too. It is about the threats to the movement that we currently have, who the opposition is and what they are driving towards. I've been involved in movements in various capacities for over 30 years, starting with my work in end-of-life care in response to the HIV and AIDS pandemic in the late 80s, and then later as a leader and architect of the LGBT rights movement in the early 90s. And time has shown that the opposition to individual liberty and self-determination is often the same and looking for the same thing. But their strategies and their tactics can change. And with some recent progress from our opposition, it's time for us to take stock of where things stand now. And we have two great guests that are experts in taking us through this assessment. You know her, we love her, our esteemed and wonderful President and CEO Kim Callanan, who's played a leadership role in the CNC for the past 8 years and became our CEO about 4.5 years ago and has a long history of understanding movements and healthcare policy. And my favorite lawyer, Kevin Diaz, our Chief Legal Advocacy Officer. Kevin has been at CNC for more than 8 years, and during his time has really grown our practice to a very robust legal program that contributed to an impressive 6 favorable rulings for end-of-life care in the past year alone. So having tremendous success. I'd be remiss if we didn't share that the mission of Compassion and Choices is the nation's oldest and largest nonprofit advocating to expand rights and improve care at life's end. And we've been enormously successful in accomplishing that to date. We can go ahead and take down the slides as we can continue to move into this. But so as we all know in recent times, and especially during this past year, the patient-directed care movement in general has been under attack. And the fallout for our movement has been very real. We are committed to remaining one step ahead of the opposition, not only to protect our gains, but to ensure our continued progress even during difficult times. To this end, we must start with a shared understanding of our opposition strategies and ultimate end game, learning from history, understanding what's happening today. And that's why we are all here today, in order so we can be looking towards the future of progress. During the session, we'll discuss the range of strategies the opposition is currently attempting to undo our rights and healthcare access. And we will discuss what we as individuals and the movement can do to counter these threats. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of our program. So we look forward to hearing from you as well. Now, let's get started with Kim. Kim, I love to hear you talk about this subject. You get kind of fiery when you do it, and I really appreciate that. But I want you now to kind of focus in on what's happening recently with the US Supreme Court ruling in Dobbs. This is something you hear about and talk about in the field a lot. I hear about, we all do. And it was around reproductive rights, but it is having a considerable impact on our work. And I'm wondering if you can share a bit about how the two are related.
Absolutely. So for people who don't know, the Dobbs ruling basically did exactly what the earlier ruling in medical aid and dying did, which took away the constitutionality of a woman's right to choose and left it up to the states to decide. So on its face, you would say, well, that's already what we had. No big deal. It doesn't have an impact. The reality, though, is it's having a pretty considerable impact. The opposition that we in the end of life choice movement face is the exact same opposition that the reproductive rights movement faces and the LGBTQ movement. It's really the Catholic Church is the primary opponent. And they fundamentally believe that their beliefs should dictate the care that people get, not people's personal values, whether that's in the beginning of life, the end of life, or in terms of sexual orientation. For Catholic affiliated healthcare providers, this comes in the form of ethical and religious directives. And it's those ethical and religious directives that govern the kind of care that you receive if you're in a Catholic facility. So in a Catholic facility, your rights are limited across all those spectrum of care. What we have seen since the Dobbs ruling is that our opponents are emboldened, and they are now feeling really on top of the world about the possibilities that are before them. And they are looking now, and we're seeing a whole bunch of evidence, and we'll go through some examples, but they are really looking to roll back long-held, long-established rights. So it's not just, is medical aid and dying legal in a state, which I think is what a lot of people sort of focus on. They're looking at a whole host of other rights that they would like to see taken away, that we all have come to sort of know and expect.
Right. So those rights to individual liberty, self-determination, what we do with and how with our bodies and our minds. I'm wondering, could you give us a couple of examples, Kim, of what you're talking about?
Sure. There's a couple that have come up recently that are just kind of mind-blowing for me. The first is the National Right to Life's top litigator and strategist, James Bopp. He was behind the Dobbs ruling. He's been behind a lot of the reproductive rights kind of progress over, or the anti-choice progress over the past several decades. He recently advanced a proposal in front of the Uniform Law Commission to eliminate the concept of brain death. So under his proposal, as long as a life support machine is keeping a heart beating and a chest pumping, you're considered alive, even if there's no hope you will ever regain consciousness, that you'll breathe again on your own, or that you'll be able to resume a normal life. And if you think about the impact this could have, I mean, you go back to some of these like really long held, long established cases that have been out there, but for decades, 40 years now, doctors have declared people brain dead, and that has been a mechanism. And if we were to revert back to a time, I mean, we can keep people alive for so long on machines now. The idea that we would, the ability to actually ever die would really come into question.
Yeah. So, Cameron, how active are these threats? Are these things that we should be kind of worried about now?
Yeah, I mean, the James Bob threat that I just gave you is before the Uniform Determination of Death. Last year, they had a year to kind of come up with a new proposal around brain death. They failed, so people did not advance his proposal, but it did stall things. He's still on a 13-panel committee, so it's still a very real possibility, and they're considering it this upcoming year. In addition to that, we've seen court cases where this similar concept has come through in the court cases. We beat back one in California that was similar to this. And I would anticipate we'll see it coming forward by way of legislation in different states, especially in states that have stronger support among the right to life. They also recently have argued that feeding tubes at the end of life should be considered ordinary care, which therefore would make them mandatory. So if you can imagine, and their whole argument, it was tied to Dobbs. They said basically, now that we've gotten rid of the constitutional right for, women to be able to have an abortion, the next law that's on the books is the fact that feeding tubes are not mandatory at the end of life. So the idea of natural death is just ludicrous, because there's nothing natural about a feeding tube being in a person, forcing them to stay alive if that's against their means. But that's another threat that's out there that's, very real. We can't take these threats for granted.
And it's always so interesting to me, Kim, about how on the surface these threats cannot appear like threats at all. Right? Like it could just be appear like we're trying to practice good medicine, or we're trying to, define something in a way to help people out, like it, and then when we really dissect it, it becomes the same opposition reformulating a package in a different way, whether it's personhood amendments or things like that. And Kevin, I'm wondering, like you see so much of these threats in the court system. What are you seeing right now?
Well, I think the biggest threat is the ongoing attempt to redefine standard medical practice by allowing healthcare providers to overrule patients' treatment decisions because of the practitioner's own personal beliefs. One great example of that is the Christian Medical and Dental Association versus Bonta case in federal court in California, where physicians are seeking to take control of a patient's medical records by omitting significant medical information or holding the patient's records completely hostage. And unfortunately, the judge in that case ruled recently in favor of a temporary injunction against requiring medical providers to record a patient's request for medical aid in dying in a medical record. And when you think about that, it's really pretty surprising and in some ways earth-shattering for what the standard practice has been, because historically medical records belong to the patient, and while the doctor was a custodian of those records, they had a duty to make sure that all significant medical information was properly recorded in their chart so that the patient could receive the absolute best possible care. And now it's really unclear what exactly a doctor who objects to any specific medical treatment might seek to omit from a patient's record without the patient's knowledge. And even before, we saw some of these trends coming forward. Again, in California, in 2008, there was a Supreme Court case, the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates versus Becerra, where the Supreme Court, before the recent changes, actually prioritized faith-based organizations' right to refuse to post information about available services, they morally opposed over a patient's right to complete accurate information. And this was about essentially nonprofits that were delaying or seeking to delay people's access to certain kinds of care. And the law was envisioned to kind of be a Consumer Protection Act sort of law where, okay, they have a right to not provide these particular services or to speak their mind about their opposition, but people also have a right to understand what their options are when it comes to the medical care that they're seeking. And trying to block people through omitting information or outright deceit was something that they tried to stop. And unfortunately, in this particular case, they were unsuccessful.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's like I always think of those records as being, I forget that they're mine, right? Like I forget that they're my responsibility, and that it's the custodial care of the healthcare provider, and how that really is a refusal to provide care, like in their even unwillingness to actually document the care that I've asked for, or document or give me those records. It's super, super scary in my mind, because we saw this in HIV and AIDS, like who owns your medical care and how do you go about getting it and how do you self-determine that? So it's really fascinating to me. This is coming around again. Kim, Kevin, kind of mentioned that the courts in some ways are packed with kind of anti-choice justices, those who would kind of oppose some of what we believe in. Have we come up, and this is for Kevin, I'm sorry, have we come up with any of those issues, any of those judges, and has it impacted our work and our cause?
Yeah, it really has. First, I think it's really important to recognize that the result in Dobbs was not a surprise, that there was a curtailing of the right to control reproductive health. I think what was shocking was the blatant disregard for precedent, especially given the fact that a number of those new justices had professed their faith to the idea of stare decisis, or that precedent matters and needs to be considered. As we see more cases work their way through the courts, I think we'll see more and more examples of just how broadly certain concepts will be applied when it comes to religious exemptions, and the idea that providing information so people can make informed healthcare decisions is in some way compelled speech by these physicians who object to the kind of medical treatment that patients may be seeking. We've already, it was interesting, in open court recently, we saw one instance where the judge was actually thinking about out loud what the Supreme Court might do to with a case that he was hearing. And it was a case, again, related to providing information. And so, I don't think you can underestimate the effect of the change that the Supreme Court is having on the lower courts, because most judges don't want to get overruled, so they want to get it right. But we may see a more accelerated change in the law because lower courts may not actually wait for the Supreme Court to rule, and that, of course, is troubling. And if something does get to the U.S. Supreme Court, I think we can never forget in this movement that we have one justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, who wrote a book outlining the strategy for making states' medical aid and dying laws unconstitutional.
Yeah, and Mickey, if I can just add to that, because Kevin can't as our attorney, but we're seeing, I mean, there's so many justices across all of the states that that were packed. It's not just at the Supreme Court level. And we have literally seen in the cases that we're bringing forward, we've been up against some of those justices, and we are seeing an immediate difference in the kind of rulings. So I don't think we can understate the impact that this is going to have on us.
Yeah, and so many are appointed by governors, right, for interim seats in the same way in the states. And so that can, and then they run for election. So it can really have a profound impact on what happens in our state work too. Yeah, so during like the mid 90s or so, I undertook this kind of quizzical question, Kevin, around I wanted to tally up how many resources the LGBTQ rights movement had. And so I basically went around and found all of the organizations that I could find. And the total budgets for all of the organizations in the LGBTQ rights space in the mid 90s was equal to the budget of just one oppositional group, focus on the family, which at the time, which was a predominant player in anti-LGBT rights, as well as other rights organizations. I'm wondering if you can tell us, I'm always staggered by the opposition's budgets, and I'm wondering if you could tell us, like, who are the primary groups your work is, is opposing your work, and do they really have that much money, or are we talking about different sums nowadays? We're not hearing you at the moment. Am I just not hearing you?
Nope, sorry.
Yeah.
I think it would be very interesting to do that kind of survey, but we have some examples, certainly, of some very large organizations that have significant resources that they're bringing to bear on our issues. The first, which we've seen time and time again, is the Alliance Defending Freedom, based out of Arizona. Their budget is right around $80 million a year that they spend on anti-choice issues, including our issues. They certainly were involved with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And they alone are 4 times the size of CNC and heavily focused on litigation. Other groups that we've come into contact with are the pro-life law and policy group, Life Legal Defense Fund, based out of California. And of course, that's just an example of 2 of them. And oftentimes they join forces, as they have in the Christian Medical and Dental Association versus Bonta lawsuit that I just mentioned. And that doesn't include other groups like the National Right to Life Committee that Kim already mentioned, as well as, say, certain, like the Catholic Church, where they get involved in these sorts of things, either as plaintiffs and or funding attorneys to fight us on those issues.
Gotcha. Kim, we've kind of been focused a little bit more on the policy and legal challenges, and we have some time to kind of dissect this a little bit further. And I'm wondering if you could talk us through another big challenge that I hear you talk about often, and that's about healthcare itself and the challenges that we face there. So could you share a little bit more with our audience today about what your take is on that?
Sure. So Catholic healthcare is governed, and I think I spoke about this a little bit in the beginning. They're governed by ethical and religious directives. And if you ever want an interesting read, you can Google Catholic ethical and religious directives, and you'll see them. And I think the end of life directives are like directives 70 to 75 or something like that. And they outline the care that is acceptable and not acceptable across a whole host of things. But of course, we're focused on the end of life. Basically, anything that would accelerate death or lead to intentional death is not allowed under the ethical and religious directives. So that means medical aid in dying is absolutely not allowed. Palliative sedation or terminal sedation, where somebody who is put unconscious, given enough pain medication so that they're not suffering. And then if you were to withhold their food, they probably would not get their food withheld or anything like that, because that would accelerate death. Feeding tubes is another one that often kind of comes up on whether or not a feeding tube is mandatory or not mandatory or required. The amount of pain medication you get, and what in essence happens in a Catholic facility is the case goes before the ethical board, who makes the determination whether or not it fits within the ethical directives. So it's not individual people and their care plans that are dictating the kind of care you get. It's the ethical and the religious directives. And the challenge with it is that people don't know that this exists, so people don't understand. And of course, Catholic healthcare facilities provide good care in many instances. It might be the best cancer care in a particular area. It might be the care that you're affiliated with for whatever treatment you're getting. And so people don't recognize that you can provide good care in those areas, but that when it comes to the end of life, if having control and autonomy and say over what happens, you're going to be limited if you're within a Catholic facility. And the even more troubling part of it is that many Catholic facilities are now not branding themselves in any way that would allow somebody to know that they're a Catholic facility. So there was a New York Times study that was done that basically showed that the vast majority of people don't even realize when they're within a Catholic facility, and that the website, the branding, the name is no longer making it abundantly clear. So if you're not actively asking the question and finding out if there are ethical and religious directives governing the care and what those are, you may be subject to a whole host of rules that you have no idea are governing the care that you get.
Wow, it's like the ultimate buyer beware, right? Like, and now that we're having to kind of shop around for better healthcare as a result of some of our insurance plans and things like that, this puts a whole nother level of shopping filter that we need to have when we're looking at trying to access our care. Kevin, how big a problem is this kind of movement? You're on mute again there, fella.
Gosh, I thought I clicked. I need to double click, I guess. Every day, this is a large and growing problem. Every day, more than 1 in 7 patients in the US are cared for in Catholic affiliated hospitals. And in 2017, Community Catalyst put out a report that showed that the number of Catholic hospitals increased over 28% over the last 2 decades, even as the number of secular hospitals has dropped by nearly 14%. And so what that means is really that people's options for the whole gamut of end-of-life care is being constricted. And what that statistic doesn't show is that oftentimes there are concentrations of where Catholic healthcare providers are located. So it's not like you'll necessarily have another choice of where to obtain your care. If it's an emergency, that there will be another hospital that you could be brought to if there was an emergency. And so, for many folks in rural areas or areas where there aren't those options, it's even more of an issue. But it does go far beyond just the hospitals. Catholic healthcare systems are gobbling up clinics, hospices, long-term care facilities, and primary care doctors. And again, those are all governed by the same ethical and religious directives. And, the one that I think surprises me the most, if I can share, is there's one that says what to do in the situation where the pain cannot be controlled. And the instruction is to inform people and educate people about the redemptive value of suffering. And hey, if that's what you want, then I'm all for it. But myself, and I think many other people, might not find that terribly satisfying when they're at their end of life.
Right. There seems like, 2 thoughts come to mind around this. One is that, there's such a long history around religious-based healthcare. And, it goes so far back in the history of the world that it kind of precedes the modern medical health that we have today. And so a lot of the thinking around it, that redemptive suffering portion of the program came when Catholic charity hospitals, the nuns, were actually providing what they thought was great medical care at the time, but was often, prayer. It was often hope and prayer and attention and support. But in a modern day, with the kind of medicine that we have today, it can cause the exact opposite effect of what we might want to have. I also think, and I don't know if you want to add anything around this, but this idea you mentioned, kind of the consolidation of medicine and what that means in a rural setting. Like, we're seeing so many community hospitals in rural environments be, no longer being able to sustain themselves and either being bought by a larger health system that might be Catholic, things like that. I don't know, Kim, do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
about that part of the puzzle? Yeah.
Yeah, it creates huge inequities in the kind of care that's available to people. Because the reality is, somebody that has means and money, it might have the resources to be able to drive to another place, or a friend who can take them, or kind of the ability to get that hour commute. But somebody who doesn't is really subjected to the care that's available in their local community. So in addition to it limiting care for everybody, it is the greatest problem among communities that are historically underserved and don't have the means to be able to compensate for the lack of care that's available.
Right. And we and others are actively trying to stop this, and have been for quite some time, this process of the consolidation of healthcare delivery, and therefore the disproportional impact that has on different communities. So it feels like it's a problem that's growing, as Kevin pointed out, and continues to be one that we have to pay attention to. Now, I mean, Kim, we are certainly trying to have the goal of systemic change here. But in the interim, what can we as individuals do to increase the likelihood that we will receive the end-of-life care that is consistent with our own values? Like, when we look at the challenges that we have, what do we have to take these on individually?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in a second, but you made a really good point that I just want to underscore, which is that we are working a lot to try to overcome it. And we actually had a win in New York last year and a win in Oregon last year around transparency of providing information about the impact a merger would have before the merger went through. So I did want to call out that. And I should say that that was a win where we worked in collaboration with the LGBTQ community, the reproductive rights. We were one voice of many in a coalition. But what was reassuring to me was to see the power when those groups all come together around our common opposition. We have success. And so that I think hopefully will leave people feeling like there is hope for the future and there are some opportunities. In terms of what you can do right now.
Actually, Kim, I'm going to actually stop you there, because there's a great question in the Q&A, which I'm trying to monitor while I'm listening to you all as well. That's specific around the Catholic Church's directives of handling medical aid and dying, where it's authorized in a state.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if either you or Kevin would kind of address what ends up happening in that situation. Right.
So the person is denied medical aid and dying. And unfortunately, what we see all too often, so the person has to go and find care elsewhere. What we often see is a misleading. So it's not just that the doctor comes forward and says, I won't provide medical aid and dying to you, and refers them to another provider. Often what we're seeing is that they say, oh yeah, I'll be there for you when the time comes. And then when the time comes, they're not there for them, and they say no, and it's too late, and they don't have time to find another provider. So that's actually what we were trying to solve in the California legislation last time around. And we drafted legislation that would require the doctor to document in their medical record that this request had been made, and transfer the medical record to another doctor. And that's what's now being challenged in the court that Kevin was talking about earlier. So Kevin, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I would just add that, we took great care to make sure that nobody who opposes medical aid and dying would have to participate. And at the same time, we had to balance that value with a patient's right to know what options were available, and to understand clearly what the limits were of what their provider was willing to do. So it was disappointing to see that even though we had taken such great care in making sure that people could opt out, that they still went to court to essentially try to stop people from accessing medical aid and dying, which to me goes beyond just not wanting to participate, but really trying to block what other people are seeking.
Yeah, we're simply trying to have honest information given to the patient. Like that's fundamentally what we're seeking. And they really are trying to subvert a patient's desires by misleading them.
Right. Listen, we have questions in the queue about this subject matter as it pertains to the monopolies in nursing home care, in hospice care, and treatment in hospice care. We're going to get to those questions in a couple of minutes. We have plenty of time. So, Kim, I do want you to go back to that question around what can an individual do with these threats upon us. And then I promise Bonnie and others that will come to their questions because this subject matter is clearly of interest to you all.
Sure. So the most important, like the thing that I would encourage everybody to do is to really be sure that as you're talking to your doctors, you know what hospital they're affiliated with, you know what healthcare system they're affiliated, and you ask them, are there ethical and religious directives that govern this? Is this a religious or a secular hospital? Tell me more about that. You have to ask in advance because at the time or the moment of an emergency, you are not going to have the wherewithal to be able to solve the problem in that moment. So getting care in advance is really important, and getting clarity in advance is really important. And I would encourage anyone who wants the option of medical aid in dying to be having this conversation now, but it goes beyond that because it impacts whether your advance directive is followed. I mean, it impacts everything around the end of life care. We have a great card called Finding a Partner Doctor. That's a little postcard. I would encourage you to use that. It gives you questions to ask. You have to ask your doctor, will you write me a prescription for medical aid in dying? It is not enough to say, will you support me? Because they view support very differently. You have to say, write me a prescription if you're going to get a real answer. And you'll see them, you'll sort of be able to tell from their body language whether they're really going to support you. We do have a doc-to-doc line. So if you have a conversation with your doctor and it's early on and they say, I don't know enough about that, then you follow up and you give them the doc-to-doc card and you say, well, here's our doc-to-doc phone number. And would you call Compassion and Choice's number and talk to one of their doctors, and they can share more about it. We have continuing medical education where they can get, which they're required to do by law, to keep their license, not by law, but to keep their license. So there's medical aid in dying ones that give them the credit they need to keep their medical license active. So we can also give them links to that. And then the other most important thing is that you appoint a healthcare proxy who's really going to be a strong advocate. That's not necessarily your spouse. Sometimes it can be very difficult for a spouse to make these difficult decisions. Think about who is the person that is able to stand up against everything and is kind of that pit bull personality, but who will represent you, not represent their values, but your values. That's the person you want to appoint as your healthcare proxy. And then the last thing that I would say is this comes up a lot around dementia care. So with dementia care, if you're in a religious or Catholic facility in particular, you may end up getting a lot more care that you want and linger in a state of dementia a lot longer than you would want. And so I really, really strongly encourage you, if you have dementia, you're going to end up in a facility, to make sure it's not a Catholic facility, but also go online and fill out our dementia values and priorities tool and create that customized care plan for your healthcare proxy, because the decisions someone has to make with dementia are really challenging. And we worked really hard to try to take the guesswork out for your loved one. And if you're in a facility that's supportive with doctors that are supportive, they will be able to help guide you through the kind of end that you would want.
Gotcha. So Kevin, I gotta get some happiness in my life around this. So, you presented, a pretty grim picture about the current courts, you and Kim kind of, yet last year you won, right? Last year you won. You had a great track record with winning or contributing to 6 impressive legal victories. I'm wondering, does that provide us something to be optimistic about?
Well, absolutely. I think so. We certainly have a good game plan for how we want to move things forward. And the critical component to that is that our litigation efforts shed light on how laws affect people when they're at one of the most vulnerable times in their lives. In giving their stories the space to be heard means that their suffering can't be ignored. either in the courts, in the legislatures, or of course in the court of public opinion. One piece of litigation that we are very proud of is the Oregon court case last year that challenged the residency requirement in the medical aid in dying law here. And after successfully settling that case, we now have a similar challenge in Vermont, and you can rest assured that more are on the way. Another somewhat surprising win was in a United States Supreme Court case. We filed an amicus brief, or a friend of the court brief, that highlighted the need of physicians to be able to practice medicine at the end of life by being able to freely treat pain based on their best medical judgment without fear of criminal sanctions, without regard to the intent that they may have in prescribing opioids. That's critical for good pain management at the end of life. And we were pleasantly surprised when the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 consistent with our position in that case. Those are just two examples. And although I can't tell you what cases we're filing next, I can assure you that we are working diligently to expand our litigation throughout the country.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I will also say, having been involved in movements for so long, there is something actually great and good, not great. There's something beneficial about having a powerful opposition and during certain periods of time, right? Because it helps us really focus in on what's important, our priorities, what's necessary, our strategies. John D'Amelio used to have who studied movements, spoke about leaping and creeping, and the times that you have when you are leaping, are directly resulted from how well you creep during these times when the opposition is being in a more powerful position. So, our goal is always to kind of build up. It also gives us the opportunity to strengthen partnerships that we have with other folks. Sometimes when you're under this kind of attack, it gives everybody a very clear perspective of like how our issues are very similar and how our work can be very compatible. So that extends the resources that we put into it and leverages those resources. So Kim, I don't know if you have additional thoughts that you want to touch on before we kind of move on. We're nearing the end of our time. I want to save some room for Q&A.
Sure. Let me just give sort of two thoughts to before we close out. First of all, in terms of working with other organizations, I do think that's one of the things that makes Compassion and Choices and End of Life really unique, is that we really do work across the spectrum. Sometimes we might be partnering with the LGBTQ and the reproductive rights movement. Sometimes we're partnering with the libertarian movement, and that our kind of ability to work across a diverse stakeholders makes us really unique, and I think has been part of the secret sauce to our success. In addition to this, one of the things that I have seen time and time again that I just think is so important, and why I always remain optimistic about our future, is that we are the one issue that personally touches every single person in the world. Everybody's going to die. None of us are going to escape that. And that is such a universal feel. And as you've got the baby boomers retiring and people contemplating their own mortality as they watch their family members retire, it's a moment that has the potential to flip somebody from being an opponent to a supporter, or just neutral to being an advocate. And we've seen this happen time and time again with legislation that's moving forward, and someone who'd been our biggest barrier all of a sudden becomes the biggest, champion for us. And I think that's similar when you look at the courts. So we are going to continue to see people that you would not expect to be on our side because they have personally experienced it. And that's something that I think is so important for us, and why it is so important that we remain about the issue and not get too mired down in the politics of it. We've got to continue to stay above the politics, above the political fray, and stay focused on what we're trying to accomplish. And we will bring more and more people into this movement.
Great. Thanks, Kim, very much for that. In just a couple of minutes, we're going to open there's so many questions. I can't even begin to tell you. It's very exciting. But if you could put the slides back up, we do want to give you some opportunities. I mean, the only way we're going to be successful, as you heard me say, is if we continue to build during times like this. And so there are ways for you to get involved. Number one, we need to hear your story. There are some stories coming in the Q&A here. Tell your story. Note that we are particularly in need of stories about the impact of religious healthcare, and what it's had on access to care or care options for you. So please, if you have that experience, go to How Can I Help tab on our website and go on our homepage at compassionatechoices.org and click Tell Your Story. If this is about a report or request for legal help for a system failure and you want to get to Kevin's team, then you're going to go to cnc.link/legal on the website. And there you'll be able to learn about our legal program and go ahead and submit an intake form. Tell your story there. Okay, so legal goes there, telling your story of experience in healthcare, particularly religious healthcare. You can go to either place, but definitely go to one or the other and tell us your story. The second is, as Kim said, you're going to need to be able to advocate for yourself, and those around you are going to have to be able to advocate for you too. So spend some time at Finish Strong on our website. Make sure you're prepared, knowledgeable about what you want to have happen. And then, as I put it, go chat with people about it. Promote it. Let people know on your care team, in your long-term care facility, wherever it might be. You can sign up to be a CNC volunteer, including our executive volunteer program, which is really cool. It's when you can take your lifetime of expertise and experience, and we'll match it to a project that we're doing so that you can have some great fun and quality experiences in advancing this mission that you believe in and that you want to engage in. And then finally, I'd be remiss, there's the Volunteer Center. If you click at How I Can Help, you can click to go to the Volunteer Center as well to sign up to volunteer. And of course, every dollar matters. We never know whose dollar is actually going to take us over the top and have a victory somewhere. So we appreciate every dollar that comes from you. So any size contribution, thank you so much for your contribution. You can always, anytime, day or night, click on the donate button on our website and make a contribution. Now, team, we have a ton of questions. One that came very early on, we talked a lot about Catholics and Catholic healthcare. I do want us to touch a little bit, and I mentioned focus on the family, on the evangelical and Christian right. Beyond the Catholic faith in and of itself. And I'm wondering if you all have thoughts about that specifically, and how does that play into this? And then added on to that, Seventh-day the Adventist healthcare, and what are some of the barriers there?
Sure. The reason we focus so much on Catholic healthcare is because they are the dominant force within healthcare among religious entities. So it is true that other religious entities, I don't know that the evangelicals have, I haven't come across a lot of evangelical health systems, but Adventists do. They will also have an opposition, or may also have an oppositional policy, but they're so few and far between. When you look at healthcare, Catholic healthcare is just the dominant force. There are some Jewish healthcare centers, and many of them have neutral policies or somewhat supportive policies. So not all religious healthcare is problematic, but all Catholic healthcare is, and that's why we focus so much on it. The evangelicals do come up in the South when we're trying to advance legislation. I mean, they're a really, really dominant force down there, but the likelihood in those places that we're gonna successfully advance medical aid in dying legislation is not particularly likely at the current moment. So in the places where there's promise that you could advance legislation right now, they tend to be more dominated by the Catholic Church, and they are the ones that are advocating for us within the legislature. Anything you would add to that, Kevin or Mickey, either one?
Nope, I think you're good. I want to actually, we have a question from Bonnie about the hospice mission, right? The hospice mission is about valuing the quality of life over quantity of life. And it just seems like, hospices would do whatever they could to not be overcome by, an entity that is, that has the Catholic, the ethical and religious directives. So how does that happen? Like what's going on there? Is it business?
No, actually, the Catholic Church, hospices actually came out of Catholic healthcare. So the very first hospices that were started via Catholic healthcare coming over from England. So for years, that was the only hospice that existed were Catholic hospitals and Catholic hospices, and then secular hospices started to take over. So the hospice philosophy started out never to hasten death. So it was about relieving suffering, but never to hasten death. You do see now you've got secular hospices and you've got Catholic hospices, and the secular hospices are really owning and more embracing, concepts around patient-directed care. But hospice in and of itself really did form out of the Catholic Church, and that's part of the biggest challenge.
Yeah. When you think about, I think we have some tactical questions here too, just basically in accessing care. Is there a database with the names of the providers and facilities that do not participate in medical aid in dying? It's like kind of the reverse out, right?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and something actually that we've been having a lot of conversations around, like what's the best way that we could do that. So at the moment, there is not one sort of central database that exists. In the last legislation in California, one of the things that we were successful at getting included in, which is not being challenged, is that all hospitals, health systems, hospices need to post policies on their website that indicate whether or not what their policy is around medical aid in dying. So one of the things that we're doing right now is figuring out what's the best way to gather those policies, analyze them, get them posted for people. So I think at least in California, you'll see something different, but it's extremely difficult to get those health systems to even share with you what their policies are if you don't have some type of mandatory thing like that's in California. But it's an interesting concept to focus on who doesn't as opposed to who does. So that's something that's a great suggestion that we can take a look at.
Right. There's also this sense of, and I think we want to talk to this because there's a couple of other questions in here that are related to this, that are the flip side of it. Like my doctor won't do it. How do I find a doctor? Blah, blah, blah. Like what is I live in a facility that may or may not provide it, but I don't know about that facility. How do I find out? How do I get to another doctor or find a doctor? And I feel like, Kim, what I said earlier about shopping, I know it's hard and time consuming, but some of this is there. I don't know that there's a magical list, right? And B, you don't always know because as staffs and things like that turn over in facilities, particularly smaller facilities, you never know what that answer may be at one time versus another time, right? So I think it's like, how do you arm yourself to be able to go shopping and know how to ask and get what it is that you want to get? Seems almost more important. And I want you to speak for a second, actually, Kim, to this idea of one of the reasons why we want like this medical aid in dying in particularly to be a part of your regular medical care.
Right.
So what's the impact of like having this list, right? Like,
yeah. So first off, all I should say is if someone needs the option of medical aid in dying right now, like you're terminally ill, you've got a prognosis of 6 months or less, you should call our end of life consultation program, and we will work with you to help connect you and we don't want anyone to fall through the cracks. So there are for right now, but what we want is every person who doesn't need it right now to become an advocate for yourself, because that can open up the medical system for everybody else. And I'm going to use an example that came from the childbirth movement. So if you go back to the childbirth movement, when my mother had me, she had no say over that childbirth experience. She went in, she delivered me, she had all the medication in the world, and that's what happened. Fast forward 30 years, and when I had my son, I literally had a 10-page birth plan. I went into my doctor, and when my doctor told me she wasn't going to do natural childbirth for me, I fired her and I went and I found another OBGYN. So now, ultimately, what happened over that 30-year period was that women started to demand a different kind of childbirth experience, and that resulted in doctors having to adjust their thinking. And we're seeing this right now. When you look in states that are authorized for medical aid in dying, you're seeing a huge transformation in the way providers think about it, and people changing their mind, going from kind of old, outdated, paternalistic thinking to a much more patient-directed, not just patient-centered, but patient-directed approach. So what I would ask everybody on this call is to be an advocate for yourself, so that we can change the system. And if you do that and you go to your doctor and you use our Find a Partner doctor and you have that conversation with your doctor and you fire them, or you go into your healthcare facility system and you sort of explain why this is hard, and our staff on the ground can help work with you on this and support this. We've done little organizing campaigns in different communities to get them to adopt supportive policies. You're going to start seeing things open up. And that's ultimately what we want. So we want to be about systemic change and integrating this into medical care. But we do not want anyone who is currently needs the option of medical aid in dying to suffer. So if that is you, contact our end-of-life consultation program and we will support you in a more direct way.
Yeah. So there's two other lines and a couple of things I just want to kind of clear up. So there's a question about whether CNC will be surveying medical facilities read the ethical and religious directives. I think if, as Kim mentioned in California, we are surveying, in particular, starting with hospice and other organizations around their provision, their willingness to provide medical aid in dying, what their policy is. You should assume, if you're at a Catholic facility, that they are bound by the ethical and religious directives. That is the religious faith that requires their use. And then you should be, even there, you should ask, right? So wherever you go, you always want to ask, like, what's your policy on this? So that you know going in what to expect.
Can I just add something that's important? So there's what's the policy on it? The policy can stop a doctor from participating, but the policy does not mean the doctor will participate. So you really do need to go one step further to make sure there's nothing stopping the doctor, but you also have to, or providers, depending on what state you're in, because some states now let APRNs, you do need to go down and make sure you're going to have a care team that is supportive. And that's super, super, super important, because we've had people go to places where the policy was supportive, but they did not have a supportive care team.
Yeah. There's also a question about, the religious policy, faith-based policies around end-of-life care for the major denominations. And CNC has a faith-based community director organizer who I believe is actually working on redoing that list, which CNC had a long time ago in partnership with the Universal Unitarians. So I believe that's kind of happening. So we'll take care of that. There is a question here around the connection that CNC has around medical students and, trying to advance end-of-life care systemically through medical students and medical care. Kim, can you take a quick answer to that?
So under our Doctors for Dignity program, I know that Dr. Rebecca Thoman does do some work in this area. She has a great internship that with 2 medical students that are designed around health equity. And I know we're looking to do some curriculum as well. But Mickey, I'm going to toss it back to you to see if you know anything else, since the medical team actually falls under you.
Right now, I think that's where we are. So
right.
Let's see if it goes any further than that. And I'm going to toss one to Kevin. We have a couple really specific legal questions here. So in Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court asked the plaintiffs and defendants to submit memos on the impact of Dobbs' decision on Kliegler versus Healy case. Do you have any updates on the case or understand why the SJC would want this info or be concerned about the Supreme Court's decision?
Well, the current state is that we have submitted those briefs, and we are now waiting with bated breath to see how they rule. I do want to say hello to Roger. I saw him ask some questions. Roger Kligler, who's our one of our main plaintiffs in the cases on this webinar. Thank you so much, Roger, for your support. I think it was interesting that they asked the question, and we took it as an opportunity to remind the court that, as in times past, the state court can interpret its constitution differently than the Supreme Court interprets the federal constitution. So just because the federal government doesn't want to provide a right doesn't mean that a state can't do so. We think there's ample grounds for the SJC to rule in our favor. Massachusetts, I believe, was the first state to find a constitutional right to marry. We are hopeful that they follow suit in our case as well.
Great. And Kevin, I'm going to slide in one last question for you because we are at time, so you have to be brief. And watch, it's a huge question. Is there any settled law regarding VSED by advance directive in the case of dementia?
I think the answer is no.
Okay. That was about as quick as it gets, Susan. There you go. Thanks for that question. There are other questions in the queue. We're sorry that we weren't able to get to everybody, but we will capture these. And if we have your name, it's not anonymous. We'll see if we can do some follow-up with you if it's a specific question. Okay. Everybody, thank you so much, Kevin and Kim, for your time and expertise today. If you are not involved with Compassionate Choices, or if you're involved in only one way, now's your chance to become involved or increase your involvement. We've given you 6 different ways. Tell your story, make a contribution, volunteer. We'd love to see more of you now and on future webinars. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.